Most recently, however, you had a book come out in February of this year called Super Communicators. And I've got a copy that you very kindly sent me right here, which our YouTube viewers can see. So that was a delight to use for studying for this episode, for preparing the
Oh,
research for
good.
this. Thank you. And so, what compelled you to write this book, Super Communicators?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist, and so I always thought that I was a pretty good communicator. But then I got into this weird pattern with my wife, and we've been married for 20 years. Are you married?
I am not, but I really like where this story is going. This is great for on air.
You've probably been in relationships, so you probably are sort of familiar with this pattern. So I would come home from work and I would start complaining about my day, and I'd be like, my boss doesn't appreciate me, and my coworkers don't understand me. And my wife very practically would give me some advice. She would say something like, "Why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other?" And instead of being able to hear her good advice, I would get even more upset. And I would say,
Mm.
"Well, you should be supporting me. Why aren't you outraged on my behalf?" Then she would get upset because I was criticizing her for giving me good advice. And so I went to these researchers and I was like, "Look, I fall into this pattern and I'm a professional communicator. Everyone I know also falls into this pattern, right? Everyone listening or watching this has probably had this in their own relationships. Like, what is going on here? Why does this happen?" And the researcher said, "Well, we're really glad you came and asked us, because we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication. And one of the things that we figured out is that most of the time when we have a discussion, we assume that discussion is about one thing, right? We're talking about our day or about our kids or about where to go on vacation. But they said, what we have discovered is that every discussion is actually made up of multiple different kinds of conversations that you sort of cycle through. And in general, those conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There are these practical discussions where we're solving problems together, we're making plans. But then there are also emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. I want you to tell me that, like, you understand. And then there's also social conversations, which are about how we relate to each other and society, and the social identities that are important to us. And they said, what we've discovered is that if you are having different kinds of conversations at the same time, you can't really hear each other. You can't connect. And that's what was happening with me and my wife. Of course, I was coming home and having an emotional conversation, and she was responding with a practical conversation. But they said, if you can match each other, if you can figure out what kind of communication, what kind of conversation is happening, and you can match the other person and invite them to match you, then you become aligned, what's known as neurally entrained. And suddenly you feel connected to each other, even if you don't agree with each other. You trust each other more, you like each other more, you feel a sense of psychological safety.
That is amazing. You've already made an impact on conversations that I think about. I definitely skew towards the practical decision-making conversation. I guess
Yeah.
probably a lot of our technical listeners, we've got a lot of data scientists, machine learning engineers, software developers listening to this show. You're probably thinking about, how do we solve this? And so your partner or friend or colleague comes to you and says, "Yeah, I'm having a bad day." And all they really want is you to sympathize with that. And I am so bad at that, because I
Right.
kind of
You're
just
like,
think,
okay, here's what you should do, right? Here's
yeah,
here's the plan to make your day better. And they're like, you.
yeah. So neural entrainment. So I've through doing some research from your book, I haven't written the whole. I haven't read the whole book. I haven't written any of the book. I haven't read the whole book, but I did already. I was aware of these kind of three categories of conversation that you just mentioned. So I'll recap them back to you. The first is that practical decision making kind of conversation, where you refer to this in the book as a "what's this really about" conversation. And then you have the second category, which you also alluded to in the story there, where it's how do we feel? So these are emotional conversations. And then the third, which you mentioned there, we haven't had a nice anecdote about it yet, but the third style of conversation is this who are we conversation, these exploratory social conversations where they're likewise, I guess, in that kind of conversation, you're not necessarily looking for some kind of practical outcome, but there also isn't necessarily any kind of emotional element to it.
And there can be an emotional element. So what happens is when we're in a conversation, we often move through all three of these conversations regularly, right? We might start emotional and then get practical and then get social and then go back to emotional, then go back to
Mm,
social. What's important is that we move together. So,
mm.
as just an example, you know, once I heard this from these researchers and I explained it to my wife, we now have a new routine, which is right. Good. She really appreciated me
Yeah,
telling
let
her,
me explain what the researchers say
honey,
about your
right? What you
problem.
want to do, honey. Um, but what now? Like when I come home and I start complaining, my wife will often ask me, do you want me to solve this for you, or do you want me just to listen and empathize?" And I actually really enjoy having her ask that. I mean, it's basically a way of saying, like, I want to help you. How can I best do that? And then I might say, I just need to get this off my chest and vent, and I'll vent for a little while. And then she'll say, okay, I'm really appreciate hearing that. And I totally understand how you're feeling. Can we talk about solutions now? And we sort of move to solutions together. So what's important is that we're moving together, that we become aligned at one point, at which point it becomes very easy to move together. And one thing I wanted to mention that you had mentioned before is you're right. Technical people, folks who are engineers, who are used to solving problems, very often their instinct in a conversation is to fall into that habit, to speak in such a way as if it was practical. But that does not mean that they don't have emotional conversations or social conversations. It means that their habitual way of expressing themselves is through a practical tone of voice. But we've all been in that situation where we're feeling something and we try and explain it in a logical way, but we realize this is an emotional conversation. Like, I'm trying to tell you how I feel. And actually, I don't want you to solve the feeling for me. I want you to listen and empathize. And so it's important to realize that even if you're someone whose habit is to fall into a practical conversation, that does not mean you can't have emotional conversations or that you can't have social conversations or that you're going to have to talk in a completely different way. It means oftentimes recognizing and helping other people understand that I'm having an emotional conversation with you. I feel your feelings, but the way that I express them sometimes is a little bit different from the way you express them.